Hi, I'm BECMI Berserker. As a 51-year-old D&D veteran, I can no longer remain silent. I see my hobby in flux once again, and just need to say something, anything, to release the build-up of anxiety that has been slowly growing within me over this so-called golden age of Dungeons & Dragons. My interest in role-playing games began in the early 80s with fighting fantasy books by Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson. You remember Warlock of Firetop Mountain, Forest of Doom, Deathtrap Dungeon? They were an amazing gateway into the world of fantasy gaming. After quickly becoming hooked, I sought adventure through more immersive means, and in 1983 came across Dungeons & Dragons, graduating to Mensa's basic set in all its red box glory in 1984. Although I have indulged in other RPGs, most notably Traveller and Star Frontiers, I always came home to D&D, and I've played every version of it up to 2008, including Pathfinder. However, something in me changed during those years of 3.5. Although I had been as much of a fanboy as anyone else about the system, I didn't notice how much the rule set was exhausting me, and eventually, and this sounds dramatic, 3.5 broke my brain. Seriously. I just couldn't look at an RPG book for a long time. I fell out of love with the game after the release of 4th edition, by all accounts not missing much. But the pull of my hobby ended up being too strong. So I returned to BECMI, the version of the game I found most happiness in, and D&D became the easy, fluid and enjoyable game I nostalgically remembered it being. I began DMing modules from my BECMI collection, slowly killing my players in the Caves of Chaos or the Streets of Threshold. The player characters, that is, not the actual players. I kinda needed the players. This return to old school gaming was extremely therapeutic and fun, and it was clear to me then that I'd been sold a shiny new object in 3rd edition without understanding it was the root cause of my issues with my D&D experience. My playing style and best experiences have made heavy use of role-playing. I love using voice characterization to help players identify with NPCs, from Cockney Londoner thief types to camp magic users to Mississippi farmer halflings. It all makes for a good laugh at the gaming table. But when a system becomes about the build and the combat, the role-playing element loses something. I noticed players paying less attention to plot and nuance and spending their energy on how to take advantage of feats and items as they gained levels. The writing was on the wall. So when D&D Next was announced, the working title for 5e development, you could forgive me for being skeptical. It was 2 years after its release when I finally took the plunge, and that was because I listened to the noise around me, telling me that it really does balance old school feel with newer additions. It didn't. That was the sales pitch. I was sucked in, and then it was Groundhog Day. My players only wanted to play 5e, with one of my group starting to refer to our old game as BECMI. They'd been seduced, and I was carried along. And now here we are, at another crossroads. For the past few years, I have again found myself wondering, what's up with my game? I've wondered why it doesn't feel as satisfying as it used to. I thought that maybe my creativity was stifled or that I'm just getting older. But now I think about it, it's just that this DM has lost the initiative. In fact, I think lots of us have. But what do I mean by that? The last 20 years has seen an explosion in the RPG industry, with a plethora of products available to play and support your play. We've seen 4 editions of D&D, if you count 3.0. There's been the launch of Paizo's Pathfinder RPG and Pathfinder 2. And then there's been various Warhammer and Warhammer 40k role-playing manifestations, Dungeon Crawl Classics, Traveller redevelopments, Cthulhu growth, just to mention the heavy hitters. On top of these, there's been the support products. Minis, battle maps, counters, condition markers, terrain props, etc, etc. D&D and RPG customers in general never had it so good, and the medium never, before, knew such product support. Alongside this was the growth of internet support for both the gaming industry and the community in general. The hunger for more online RPG material and content has filled the gap between gaming sessions, and for most of us has become the majority of our gaming. A kind of non-gaming participation in the hobby we love when our groups weren't able to get together. It all seemed really positive for gamers, but I couldn't help wondering that as we fed the beast, we just ended up craving more. More content, more rules, and just more stuff. How many hours have you spent on D&D Beyond just rolling characters and playing with builds? Have you heard of empty calories? Well, I think this is a kind of empty gaming. Sure, some people may enjoy it, but it's not the objective of the game. This appetite was ripe for exploitation, which was sated somewhat by the rise in virtual tabletop availability and quality. Sure, this was at first seen as a great alternative option when not being able to get your players together. However, the recent COVID pandemic has changed everything. So much so that with One D&D, virtual tabletop is set to become the primary space for where D&D is to be played. To quote the critical drinker, believe that. Let me just state clearly, I'm not a Luddite. I've run games on Roll20 and Foundry VTT and they've been fun. But there's a behavioural change going on here that the pandemic sped up. Players are preferring to stay at home rather than meeting up. And with VTT getting more and more glossy and sophisticated, there's less reason for many players to leave the comfort of their homes, especially when it means avoiding the difficult discussion with a partner who prefers you at home. The behaviour of players is being nudged towards finding this platform preferable, and in the mainstream market I think it will be successful because it will become the easiest way to obtain your D&D fix, or indeed for all RPGs, as I find it hard to believe other gaming institutions will resist the potential to make more profit once WotC blazes the monetization trail, although I'm banking on some resisting the temptation. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me reel it back a bit. The recent demise of my interest in 5 years come as no surprise to me, given similar happened with 3rd edition. I started playing in the heady Redbox days and have played my way through the last 4 decades. However, in the last few years it's been difficult to enjoy the latest 5th edition version of D&D, and I find myself being a bit of a downer by complaining about the system most of the time. My players are great, and I love them. I've even recently completed running a Princess of the Apocalypse campaign for them, for which you can find a narrated write-up here on this channel. So this is not their fault. It really is a case of, it's not you, it's me. This feeling has been creeping up on me despite some really good games out there and some really great friends to play with. It's prompted me to reflect on how such a turnaround in my enthusiasm to play has come about. And I think I can say that, simply put, it's down to there being too much stuff. Seriously, my brain aches from all the information there is these days about D&D. I can try to ignore it, but as soon as I play at another table, someone is quoting some errata at me or is telling me I can now add this to that to achieve X or Y. And when I state I want to ignore this stuff and just get on with the rules as written in my hardcover books, which are probably out of date for some reason, I'm greeted with skepticism, as if the willful refusal to incorporate release after release of updates into my game is somehow blasphemous. And this is what I really mean about us DMs losing the initiative. It's our initiative that we are losing, by becoming over-dependent on an overcomplicated system that is at the whim of those who think they know best about our game. I mean, before the internet, stick with me any youngsters out there please, the only people who could decide if a rule needed tweaking, redesigning or removing were those playing in a particular group. That would be about 5 or 6 players. RPGs had nothing like the amount of testing they have today, so they were sometimes a bit rough around the edges. But we players rounded them off, in our own way, and the games became individual. They became what the players wanted, and these made for the most memorable games us old farts reminisce about. Even the way early modules were written allowed for the individualization of approach and design. Keep on the Borderlands, an undisputed classic, had a multitude of NPCs for characters to interact with, but none of them was ever given a name or personality. The DM had to come up with them. This meant the NPCs could fit an individual's DM's mind's eye and allowed the microcosm world of the keep to develop in his or her own way. The DM used their initiative and was rewarded for it. Now I know there will be many people listening to this thinking, but you can do that today. No one's telling you which rules to use. It's your game. Sure, you can house rule here and there, but pretty soon a player is asking to introduce some race from a new splat book, capable of a super slice combo, and the pressure of what you want as a DM versus player enjoyment just gets a little too much. In addition, house ruling 5e carries a ton more risks than old school versions. Essentially because the rules system is a house of cards. Allow one thing and all of a sudden you've given away an ability that should be conveyed through a feat. Disallow something else and you've affected how certain monsters use tactics and completely devalued a trait. What's apparent to me now is that less is more. Obvious, I know. D&D has fallen into the trap of more stuff or options equals better. But my best experiences have been where there hasn't been a rule for something and we winged it. The situation becomes ambiguous. I commented recently on Professor Dungeon Master's channel when he was giving his own thoughts on One D&D and argued that ambiguity is a major part of D&D that's been squeezed out of the game by the development of more and more rules for situations. Ambiguity is what makes for the best role-playing sessions. It's when you're at your most vulnerable. It's exciting, and no one can call how things are going to go. It's what's a huge part of old school D&D, developing the imaginations and decision-making abilities of DMs and players so that D&D truly was a collaborative walk through the unknown rather than the hand-holding version that 5e is today. It is sorely lacking in newer rule sets that seek to cover all the bases, and I'm certain that One D&D or 6th edition will continue that trend. So let me finish with my thoughts on One D&D. After all, that's why I started this thing, and I hope you're still listening to me ramble on. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that One D&D, that is 6th edition, is actually going to end up being good for old-timers like myself and others who prefer the old-school version of the game. Christ, did I just call myself an old-timer? Anyway, we know that 6th edition is going to cater to a demographic that has no issue with subscriptions for things they'll never own and microtransactions for virtual items that don't exist. Fine, more power to those who enjoy that sort of thing. However, I think we're going to see a return to old school D&D being the niche hobby we enjoyed way back when, and that's actually going to be a good thing. I believe we're going to see a growth in interest in old school gaming by younger generations, which will generate the energy required to give the original vision of D&D longevity. I'm not sure it's going to be a very profitable area for game publishers to operate in, but most publishers outside of WotC and Games Workshop / Warhammer seem more focused on supporting gaming communities with great products, a reciprocal arrangement if you will, one based on creating shared value. That is, the publisher develops a great product, the consumer feels served and valued, and so the consumer remains faithful to the publisher and advocates for them. It isn't a model for huge growth, but it is a model for sustained business, one that gamers value. If WotC is set to lose anything with the coming edition, I think it'll be brand advocates in the over 40s with disposable income, which is not a good thing when trying to diversify into branded tangible goods. Anyway, I see a rise in old school gaming coming, coupled with more people meeting up to discover this new, way of playing, but also more VT support for those who want it. Foundry VTT springs to mind in terms of non-subscription models. It would be foolish not to step into the space 6th edition will leave behind when WotC launches its newfangled VTT platform with all its supposed bells and whistles. So I guess what I'm trying to say with all this is that it's time for us to win back the initiative for the sake of not just the D&D game and fantasy role-playing in general, but also our ongoing campaigns and enjoyment. It's time to be decisive about the type of games we want to play without waiting to be told. If you hanker after the days of old school, whether it's BECMI, BX or even old school essentials, chances are there's 10 of you feeling the same way. Reach out. Form a group. Relish the ambiguity of an easier game that is lighter on your mind, let alone your pocket. Come back and let me know how it went. I plan to release more content with my opinions on old school versus 5e and One D&D, and also updates on how my own group interacts with old school as I try to steer them away from 5e. Wish me luck. I'm BECMI Berserker. Please like and subscribe if you wish to support me in making more content, and I hope to see you back here soon.